happens when you travel back in time to when Anthony Bourdain was not a world-famous chef with numerous iconic, scathing reads that still go viral to this day?
Cheers to the Queen.
No, I hate the aristocracy, man.
Our friendship is built on our mutual distrust of England.
You know, listening to you people, I gotta tell you, I wanna go out and join the Communist Party. It's like bourgeois, man. You're living off the labor of an oppressed underclass.
Death to the enemies of the people of the Republic.
Before he was Anthony Bourdain, he was simply Tony.
I need a job. You work in a kitchen before?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to review a brand new film called Tony, which is not exactly a biopic in the traditional sense, but it is presenting itself as being biographical in nature. When I think of a biopic with that abbreviated name, I think of something that aims to cover a significant portion of a famous person's life. I personally wouldn't use the word biopic to apply to a film that is honing in on a much smaller portion of a famous person's life, which is what Tony is doing. Tony is a somewhat biographical film about Anthony Bourdain in the summer of 1975, when he was 19 years old and took up a summer job in the kitchen of a restaurant in Cape Cod. First, I'm going to give you broader feedback on what the film is and how it's been executed, but then we're going to get into some of the specifics about inaccuracies. That will entail saying some of the specifics of what's in the film, but because it's drawing from material from part of Anthony Bourdain's book from the year 2000, Kitchen Confidential. I saw Tony first, and then I read Kitchen Confidential, which I checked out from my local library. All of you should support your local library because they let you read books for free. They are a community resource, and they also have things like DVDs. That's right, you heard me. You can watch movies for free, thanks to your local library. There's a quote from Kitchen Confidential that reads, "Taking that one job as a dishwasher at the Dreadnought essentially pushed me down the path I still walk to this day." This more or less sums up the primary function of the film insofar as what it's meant to teach the audience about Anthony Bourdain's origins. It also functions as a coming-of-age story. It unflinchingly probes into the mayhem of Anthony's adolescence, complete with compulsive lying and reckless shenanigans. Dominic Sessa fully commits to the role, but it's Antonio Banderas who delivers the most beautifully understated performance. He is the emotional heartbeat and moral compass of this coming-of-age story. When you regard Tony as an isolated story, a work of fiction with a dramatic narrative, an arc that will take its protagonist on a transformative journey, it works. However, after reading Kitchen Confidential, especially the portion from earlier on in the book, which is seemingly meant to be the film's primary source material, I feel mixed about this film. There is so little accuracy that it did end up slightly lowering my impression of the film after the fact. It's still well made and very well acted, very effective at provoking an emotional response from its audience, but I have no doubt that I would have a more favorable opinion of this film if it was simply an isolated work of fiction, as opposed to something that presents itself as being a biographical film about Anthony Bourdain. When you meet this teenage adolescent, Tony, he is absolutely insufferable. It's very much the sort of film that needs to be experienced in the cinema because the streaming-only audience, especially the people who are not cinephiles, are more likely to witness how self-aggrandizing and obnoxious he is when we first meet him, and swiftly lose all patience, switch it off and look for something else to watch instead. You have to not only be patient as a viewer, but already have bought into the journey of the film's story so that you will see it through to the end. There are lessons he learns, valleys and peaks, and of course, anyone even superficially familiar with Anthony Bourdain will know that this teenage version of himself and his personality is in no way his final form. You think of the Anthony Bourdain we know from those clips of his show, there's this worldliness to him, he's culturally respectful as long as you're not classist or a monarchist, of course. He's someone that has a hunger for exploring and celebrating all of the diverse food that the world has to offer, and the cultures that are attached to that food. But Tony, teenage dirtbag Tony, he's going to be reckless, hyperfixate on trying to win over a love interest. It's borderline nightmarish at times to sit through an obnoxious personality prone to compulsively lying about anything and everything he's doing.
Mr. Bourdain, the committee has decided to go with another student for the fellowship.
Now I want to talk about some of the details of this film in the context of comparing this barely an adaptation to the small sliver of the book, Kitchen Confidential, from which it seems to draw its inspiration. The film opens with a quote, "I was, to be frank, a spoiled, miserable, narcissistic, self-destructive, and thoughtless young lout, badly in need of a good ass-kicking." There couldn't be a more accurate description of Tony, the version of him that we spend most of the film's runtime with. Given how long it takes and how much of an ordeal he has to experience before finally reaching a point of personal growth, maturation, trying to get himself on a better track in his life. I should make a distinction, though, about deeming a film to be of a good quality, technically speaking, versus the amount to which you personally enjoy watching a film. Would I rate this film favorably because of how well acted it is and how it presents this transformative arc? Yes, I would. Did I also find young Tony to be incredibly insufferable to the point of exhaustion? Also yes. Whether or not I recommend a film like this is really going to come down to whether or not you as a viewer have the patience to sit through a journey with a character like this for as long as he acts the way that he does. He's someone that is hard to root for, but if you like to see stories where the protagonist's ugliest personal defects are being excavated like this, then absolutely I would recommend it. Tony's love interest in the film is a girl named Nancy, whom he already knew from high school, and now they both attend Vassar College. In real life, Anthony and Nancy from Vassar were already dating on and off by this point in their lives. It began from the time that they were in high school, and then they eventually got married in 1985, and remained so for 20 years, before divorcing in 2005. The film is not depicting their relationship as something that's already on, whereas in real life it was. In the film, he's trying to convince her to reciprocate his seemingly one-sided interest. When you know this, and you consider why they would make a choice like that, I suppose it makes sense in the overall vision of trying to create arcs for the characters in this ensemble to go through, but mostly the arc for Tony himself. It's also a way of showing more of his worst qualities at this point in his life, and how desperate he is to impress her to the point of doing things like compulsively lying about more or less everything. Although there's a passing mention in this film of Tony already having some familiarity with food and cooking by way of his father, for the most part, the film presents Tony as someone who truly builds this connection with food and finding this spark and passion for food over the course of this particular summer. However, if you read the very first part of Kitchen Confidential, there is a period of time that's covered from earlier on in Anthony Bourdain's life that conveyed a completely different story of how he found his passion for food. It happened in France when his family would go on holiday there. He started to eat more varied food than what he would experience back in the States. He would be able to try very fine cuisine. He had his first oyster and even learned how to open an oyster when a French man, I think it was a French fisherman actually, taught him. The Tony that they show in the film, he does not know how to open an oyster at this point in his life. He has to be taught that, and we see it happen in the film. Although it makes for a fine enough storytelling device, I cannot help but feel conflicted at them choosing to alter something that's more or less a canon event in the real Anthony Bourdain's life. The way that he talks about oysters in the book, and especially him trying his first one, freshly caught, he puts it either on par or even above the first time he got intimate with a woman.
Intimate? Is that how old people say sex?
As far as other character details go, one of the things briefly mentioned by Bourdain in the Kitchen Confidential book is that Bruce Lee was one of his personal idols, and we do see Bruce Lee on a poster in Tony's room. in the family home in the film. There was also a mention in the book of him carrying nunchucks around, and you do briefly see that for him in the film as well. There is a point in the film where you see Tony trying to claim that he's more capable in the kitchen than the other staff are giving him credit for. So one of the chefs tells him to pick up a pan, or maybe it was a skillet, but either way, Tony attempts to do so and he burns his hand. He's taken aback by the heat and the injury that he suffers from this. He asks for burn cream and he is mocked for this. One of the chefs proceeds to pick up that same pan with his bare hands and has no reaction to the heat. I believe there's a slang term for this, asbestos hands, where the chefs who work in kitchens, over time they build up a higher tolerance for handling extremely hot objects. Now, the way this occurrence is included in the film is such that it's happening earlier on in his time working in this kitchen. However, in the Kitchen Confidential book, that incident with the hot pan takes place later on, after that restaurant he was working in was purchased by different owners. The new owners wanted to give the staff a chance to, how shall we call it, audition to keep their jobs, tryout. Everyone else there at these tryouts was far more experienced than Anthony Bourdain, so he completely cracked under the pressure and did not perform at the standard of the others who were in the kitchen. And among other things, while these tryouts were going on, he burned his hand. Broadly speaking, the other characters you see as the secondary leads of Tony, or the members of the core ensemble that work in the kitchen alongside Tony, these people do not match the names or descriptions of what Anthony Bourdain described in Kitchen Confidential as his colleagues in that specific kitchen. However, certain things about the atmosphere and vibes, the reckless behavior, debauchery, hedonism, illicit substances, that similarity is maintained from the book to the film. I don't necessarily believe that the film shouldn't have made any changes to what was written in the book. The information Anthony Bourdain shares in Kitchen Confidential about this summer is rather short, and when talking about that one summer, there's not really enough in there to directly copy and paste into a film to where that story could work as a standalone dramatic narrative that would feel compelling and transformative for Tony as the protagonist we follow, as an uninitiated audience who hasn't read the book. That being said, I do feel somewhat conflicted about a few of those changes that were made, more so because I do think that existentially speaking, this is a work of art that is presenting itself as biographical, and if you're going to be biographical, some of the details should probably have been more accurately conveyed in the film's narrative. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but the oyster thing is one of the first things that comes to mind. For Anthony Bourdain to describe his first time eating an oyster the way that he did, and learning to open it, and all of this happening in France, I don't like how it wasn't true to that experience in the film. I'm well aware that this isn't going to matter to an uninitiated audience. They will not be comparing it to its source material. As I've already said, it works as a standalone film, but being that I am someone who does make a habit of reading source material on a semi-regular basis to consider when reviewing a film adaptation, I have to be honest in my feedback. I will still rate the film positive when the options are positive or negative, but if it's an adaptation where I've read the book, which in this case I did after the fact, I want to foster an interest among the people who watch my reviews to read more books. It doesn't necessarily have to be Kitchen Confidential specifically, but there are loads of great books and films out there that are worth exploring. There are a couple of other details that are maintained in the adaptation process. Late night fishing, digging pits in the beach which get filled with hot coals and then put new trash cans in there which have been filled with seafood, vegetables, and potatoes. That was all in the book, and we see it happen in the film. The main change or creative liberty the film takes that I personally enjoyed was anything and everything to do with Chef, the character Antonio Banderas plays. Anthony Bourdain talks a lot about the heavy Portuguese influence in this Cape Cod area when he was working there. The depth, humanity, and humor that Antonio Banderas gave this character was incredibly moving to watch. To be honest, watching him perform this character made me want to rewatch Dolor y Gloria. I haven't seen that since back when it was first released in cinemas. Chef is the heart of this movie. I know I've already said that. And I also understand that it's supposed to be about Tony becoming Anthony Bourdain. But for me personally, he was just so insufferable for a significant amount of the runtime that I would often find myself wishing that the movie had been about Chef instead, even though he's mostly a fictional character. He feels like an original creation, although some of the details feel as though they might have been borrowed from a person that gets mentioned in Kitchen Confidential, whom Anthony Bourdain referred to as Bigfoot. Bigfoot was described as being a large man, over 6'4", an ex-jock. That does not match Antonio Banderas, nor does the timeline of the relationship that Bourdain describes with Bigfoot. Anthony met Bigfoot while he was still at culinary school, not while he was working in Cape Cod. However, Anthony describes Bigfoot as being someone that transformed him. He is the reason Anthony wakes up before his early morning alarm. He never wanted to disappoint Bigfoot. And those are the types of details that feel like they were used for building Antonio Banderas' character in the Tony film. To summarize, I rate the film more favorable than not. Great performances, transformative arc, Tony learns some much-needed humility. And if you like stories which follow protagonists with these types of character flaws, it'll be exactly to your liking. The next film adaptation I will be reviewing will probably be The Dog Stars. I'm really looking forward to that since it's Ridley Scott and Guy Pearce is playing Pops. I need to see that movie, and I need to see a press tour full of those two divas speaking their minds.